Can you guys hear when I get Slack notifications?
Yep.
Sorry, I don't know how to turn that off, so you'll understand if I'm in the lab. It'll just keep going on and on, but
Yeah.
hopefully people don't message me too much.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming to the talk. We will start in a few minutes. Thanks for your patience. All right, I think we can start. Hi everyone, my name is Manny. I'm a member of the SAS, or Student Activism Speaker Series Committee. SAS is an open group, so if you're interested in helping select subjects and invite speakers, please email caltechy@caltech.edu to find out when our next meeting is. Our presenter today is Alexandra Phillips. She is a fifth-year geochemistry graduate student and the 2019 Science Fellow through the American Geophysical Union. She is also the co-author of the recently published journal article, A Scientist's Guide for Engaging in Policy in the United States. We will have time at the end for questions and answers, but Alex is also willing to take some time during the talk. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat. So now please join me in welcoming Alex.
Hi everyone. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
So definitely no pressure, but feel free to turn on your video if you want to, just so I'm not seeing into a stare of, black Zoom boxes, but definitely no pressure. I do want it to feel more like a conversation though, and less like you're getting a lecture. So I think that sometimes helps. I'm also going to ask you guys some questions. So I hope you can answer things in the chat as we go. And like Manny said so nicely in the introduction, my name is Alex and I'm a fifth-year geochemistry graduate student. So I'm finishing up my PhD, and I got a really great opportunity last year to be an AGU Voices for Science Fellow. And so I got to travel to DC, and this was actually about a year after I did the Caltech WISE DC trip, and that got me really interested in science policy. So I applied for the AGU fellowship, and it's a fellowship where you don't actually have to go to DC for very long, just for a weekend. We met with our representatives, we had a lot of training, and then we're supposed to complete projects throughout the year. And both of my projects I'm going to present to you guys, but the major one was writing this 10-step guide for scientists that are engaging in policy. So the first thing I want to hear from you guys is, why do you think that scientists don't engage more with policymakers? What are the barriers that might exist for scientists that, when they're talking with policymakers or even before talking to policymakers? Okay, nice, Elise. Yeah, that's totally one I've heard before. Unsure of avenues for engagement. Yeah, there's no formal training in academia for how to get involved in science policy. Yeah, anything else? How about, have any of you guys talked to policymakers before? And if not, why haven't you taken the initiative to go out and talk to policymakers? So you can answer for yourself instead of just all scientists, if that sounds daunting. Busy. Busy is a good one. That's fair. Not sure where to begin. Okay, yeah, only way to make change is by developing new technology, definitely. Yeah, I think all of these are super true. And there's so many barriers that exist for scientists that want to get involved in policy, and hopefully some of those barriers will be lowered by the end of the talk today. One thing that I hear all the time too, that I think some of you guys talked a bit about, is people saying, my research doesn't matter to policymakers. And I hear this a lot, especially in my field as a more of a geoscientist. We do fundamental science. I'm not developing new technology. Like Cora said, I'm just kind of researching this esoteric thing and I sit in a basement all day. What does that research matter to a representative that thinks about all of California, right? But what I hope that you guys can realize soon is that fundamental science does relate to policy, and policymakers want to hear from you. And if you don't think this already, just trust me, because they do. And hopefully by the end, you will agree. And in general, by the end of this talk, hopefully you're going to learn 10 steps to move from a novice to a science policy expert, some ways that we can lower that barrier of engagement. You're also going to actually complete a few of the early steps. You're going to learn about science legislation, about science funding, and even about creating a one-page research summary. You're also going to understand how to create and navigate a meeting with policymakers. And hopefully you'll be convinced that you can have a meaningful impact on science policy, that your research does matter no matter what it is you're researching. So if there's no questions, I can keep going, but feel free to interrupt at any point with questions by just saying, hey, Alex, I have a question. Or you can use the raise hand function or type in the chat. Also, if I'm talking fast, it's because I just had a coffee, so apologies. Okay, so the 10 steps for engaging in science policy. You can look at these steps in that research article that Manny mentioned. It's either Hetherington and Phillips 2020. The first step is to just learn how science policy is enacted. How does a bill become a law, and what does that look like? The next step is understanding how science is funded. You know, how is it that NASA gets its money, and how can you help NASA get more money? And then the third step is learning how to effectively communicate your research. The way that you talk to your PI is probably not the same way you're going to talk to the policymaker in the room when you have your meeting. And so understanding how to communicate your research to a broad audience is really helpful. So these first 3 steps are kind of the learn phase, doing things on your own, maybe a lot of Google searching, watching some YouTube videos, that sort of thing. The next steps are all about meetings. So you need to find your elected representatives, both locally and federally. You need to schedule a meeting with policymakers, and you need to physically meet with them. And those are all kind of drastic steps, but we'll talk about them more. And in general, I'm going to tell you guys mostly about federal science policy in these steps 1 through 6, because that offers the easiest pathway to engagement. There's definitely many ways you can engage local governments as well, but because they're so different state to state, we wrote this guide kind of more focused on federal science policy. But a lot of these steps follow the same trend, even if you're looking for your local officials. And then the next steps are kind of broadening out from your science policy circle and going past just, you know, meeting with one representative. And it's to engage in science policy at conferences, publishing policy briefs in open access, bringing science policy to institutions, and activating the community, which is hopefully, you know, as an example of what I'm doing now, but also things like citizen science projects. And so we'll talk about each of these steps in more detail, but the first step is to learn how science policy is enacted. So this is going to be a bit of like a more formal version of the Bill on Capitol Hill song. So the Senate and the House are the 2 chambers of Congress that deal with policy, and the Senate has 100 members for 6-year terms, and the House has 435 members for 2-year terms, and any of those people, those 535 people, can introduce a bill at any time. And this is probably the most common way people think that citizens can get involved, is they go to their congressperson and they say, hey, like this traffic law is really outdated, we need a new bill. And then the senator or the representative writes a new bill and introduces it. So in the 115th Congress, which is the most recently completed Congress, over 13,500 bills and resolutions were introduced to the floor. The person that introduces them, it's called being sponsored by them. And other members at any time, those other 435 House members or 100 Senate members, can add their support to the bill by becoming a co-sponsor. So once the bill is introduced, it goes to one of 20 standing committees in the House and 16 in the Senate. And these committees are really broad: finance, armed service, and then commerce, science, and transportation. And each of them have subcommittees. So it basically goes from a giant Congress to a small subcommittee of about, 5 to 10 senators or representatives. In the Senate, in the senators' committees and subcommittees, it goes to committee hearings. And these committee hearings are a place where people have all sorts of things happen. You can have private hearings, you can have public hearings like Elmo testifying at the Educations Committee is a fun one. Scientists often testify, and experts testify. And here's a place where many bills die in the committees. The bills can basically be tabled, which is the committee kind of saying, we don't really want to move forward with this bill. And there's not very many repercussions except for public or peer pressure for them to get it off the table. Now, in the rare cases that they do decide to do something with it, they mark it up and they send it back to the full committee for a vote. And if the full committee approves the bill, they report it out and it gets calendared. And this is actually another place where bills die. If your bill doesn't match the policy agenda of the person who's doing the scheduling, you might not get it through to the full vote. So if you do make it past that step, there's even more weird things that happen in the House and Senate. So in the House, everything must go to a rules committee. And the rules committee is kind of a strange process, but they basically say what sorts of things are allowed to happen when this bill goes to the full floor. Are we allowed to make amendments? Are we allowed to debate it? Are we allowed to mark it up, or does it have to be accepted as is? How are we going to vote for it, in the quick way or in the slow way? And so they really hold a lot of power, the people on this rules committee, for setting the agendas of the meetings and also deciding if your bill is going to even get a vote. And the reason that the House of Representatives has this rules committee is because, unlike the Senate, they try to do things a bit more efficiently. They try to limit long debates, and they try to make sure that anything that they bring up can be resolved within a day. Now, in the Senate, you kind of have like the opposite sort of vibe. The Senate will talk a long time about them. There's not really any rules for debates. And in fact, the way that they get the majority power check is that they can do something called a filibuster, which you've probably been hearing a lot about if you've been watching the presidential debates, because there's some talk about ending this filibuster practice, because it's kind of the idea of talking a bill on the floor to death before it can get a vote. Okay, so lots of things going on. If you manage to get all the way through this process, you get to a full vote. And if you get a simple majority in both the Senate and the House of Representatives in companion bills, then you win, right? You're getting closer. And it's kind of crazy how few bills even get to this point. And so that same Congress that we were tracking, over those 13,000 bills, only 867 were ever even brought to a full vote in either chamber. So that's only 6%. So if you're that constituent that just knocked on the door of the senator and took all this time to make sure there's a new traffic bill, it's kind of disheartening to know that there's only a 6% chance it will even ever get voted on. So then, if the House and Senate versions are not the same, which often happens because different committees mark them up and different processes in the full votes of the floors mark them up and change them in different ways, you have to create a conference committee, which is often jokingly called this like third house of Congress. And the conference committee has representatives, has senators, and they compromise on the bill, create a compromised version, and then it gets voted on again by the full chambers. And if it passes again, it's called an enrolled bill. If it's just passed by one house or Senate, it's an engrossed bill. And then basically the final version of the enrolled bill goes on to the president, which, as you probably know, he can either veto or sign. If he vetoes, both chambers have to give a 2/3 supermajority, two-thirds supermajority vote to override the veto, and either way, it will become a law. So that was kind of a gigantic crash course. So I'll stop talking for a minute because I think I see questions, but hopefully some of you that's useful information, and for others, interesting review. Okay, will these slides be available? Yes, definitely. Okay, great. Does anyone have any questions about this weird process where a bill maybe becomes a law and often does not? Okay, great. It's also super weird doing Zoom talks, you guys, because normally you can see people and people are confused or not confused, so I'm just gonna assume you guys are all experts. Okay, so how can you possibly track science policy related legislation through this mess if there's over 13,000 bills and resolutions that are getting flooded through Congress? What are you going to do? And also, whenever you are engaging with a bill, it's usually only at this intro stage or at the end stage, right? You hear about it in the press because it becomes a law or because it's being voted on, or you go to your senator and ask for a bill or resolution to be made. But it's actually a lot of great engagement opportunity in these intermediate steps, right? If I know about a science law that's passed the Senate but hasn't passed the House, I can tell my representative about it and it's really interesting, and I can say, hey, go over here and write a companion legislation bill in the House of Representatives. I can also see if a bill has a lot of support from many other Californian representatives, but not mine. I can email her or meet with her and say, hey, please co-sponsor this bill, show that you have support, and I'm one of your constituents and I think that it matters. You can also be involved in some of the hearings too as a scientific expert, or help people find experts for a bill you're really involved in. But again, we have to go back to how you find them, right?
Alex, you have 2 more questions.
Oh, okay. How long does it usually take? That's a good question. It depends. So, things like the coronavirus relief bill were pushed through really quickly. And so when there's public pressure to push things through, it can happen really fast. Otherwise, it takes months and months and months. So normally you have these 2-year periods of time where you have a certain Congress, and it can take the whole time, but I don't know what the average time frame is, but definitely a long time, especially because so many things can be halted, but I would guess at least 6 months. Okay, do certain types of bills go through the Senate versus the House? So basically any legislation that you want to pass has to go through both the House and the Senate in order for it to become a bill. And so it has to be voted on by both chambers. There's some super specific weird rules of 2 types of bills that can only be introduced in either. So the House is the only one that can introduce tax-related legislation, and the Senate is the only one that can release treaties. And I think there might be one other thing that falls under that umbrella, but the Senate basically has a little bit more power with foreign relations, and the House basically has a little more taxation sort of power. So I hope that answers those questions. Okay. Awesome. Okay, so one way to find legislation that you care about and isn't, some sort of weird bill that you don't really need to know about and you're just looking for science in this mess of 13,000 bills every 2 years, is you can directly track things with GovTrack. So I'm going to show you guys the website, if I can find it here. Oh, okay, here's the GovTrack email list. And so if you go to GovTrack, can everyone see my screen? Okay. If you go to govtrack.us, it's a nonpartisan website and you can find your representatives, your legislators. The nice thing is that you can use it to subscribe to things. And if you were to subscribe to a certain committee, you basically get email updates every week or every month, depending on your settings, and you get emailed bills that are related to your interests. It's kind of a boring email, right? It's not like anyone is annotating them. No one's putting their commentary on it, but it's very informative and it's a nice way to stay involved. In terms of what committees you might want to track, the House and Senate change committees pretty often, and science is kind of in a lot of different places. So I'm an oceanographer, and so I follow the Water, Oceans, and Wildlife subcommittee, but I also follow environment and climate change. And so it's hard because sometimes you might need to follow two subcommittees and 2 totally different committees to catch all the bills that are of interest. And I definitely don't recommend direct tracking of every subcommittee. It's better to just pick 1 or 2 where your interests are most focused. For the Senate, they're slightly different, but they somewhat agree. And again, here, I'm an oceanographer, so I study science, oceans, fisheries, and weather, but I also follow this subcommittee, fisheries, water, and wildlife. And I don't know what they do when they get a fisheries bill. Like, do they send it to the Environment and Public Works, or do they send it to Commerce, Science, and Transportation? I'm not really sure, but if I ever see one, then I will be sure to have caught it. And so if you have a specific scientific interest that best relates to one of these places, then I recommend the direct tracking. And once again, that website is govtrack.us. Okay, the second option is a bit easier, and it's indirect tracking with services like email newsletters, internet tools, and Twitter accounts. So one of my favorites is the Nature Daily Briefing, and it covers all things science and science communication and science policy. So it gives a nice broad overview of the state of science world and includes science policy updates when they're most relevant. So really big science policy news makes it to Nature Daily Briefing. Because most professional organizations that are large also have their own science policy update email list. So I'm a member of AGU, which is the American Geophysical Union, because they're the largest Earth and space science network, and they have their own science policy alert system that I subscribe to. Another great one is the American Institute of Physics. They have a really great email listserv, and they also have an online tool called this bill tracker, which I've also pulled up. It's right here. And you can basically look at bills that are currently on the Senate and currently in the House that relate to science. So they know that they're looking for people that relate to science right now. And so you can see, there's some STEM education ones that you might miss if you're tracking a committee on science, because this one probably is going to an education subcommittee, but you're probably still really interested in it. Supporting veterans in STEM careers also might go to a Veterans Affairs subcommittee, and you might miss that. Combating sexual harassment in the Sciences Act, that you're going to hear more about later today. So those are the different places that I get my science policy news. And in the supplement of my research paper that, that Manny mentioned, I also have a list of Twitter accounts that I tend to follow. And so if you look up that paper, the supplementary material has links to all of these places to sign up for things, and we can send it out when we send out the slides. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, great. Okay, so I promise this one won't be as much lecturing, but now we need to learn how science is funded. And so I think this is kind of a disillusionment that a lot of people have, especially, we know our funding is from NASA or from the NSF, but we don't really think about what process lets us get that money. And the first thing to do is know what a budget, an appropriation, and outlay is. And I had to think about this for a long time the first time I heard it, because I did not know the difference. So does anyone happen to know the difference between a budget and an appropriation? If no one knows, I'm going to make Greg try. Is appropriation what part of the budget goes forward? Yeah, that's a pretty good way to put it. Anyone else? Does anyone know what an outlay is? No, that's fair. Okay, so basically a budget is kind of like what you and me would think of as a budget. It's all government income and spending, and it's submitted by the Executive Branch White House Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, in early February, and it's basically the president's recommendation for its overall fiscal policy. And Congress then makes a budget resolution that's kind of like a blueprint. So you can think of a budget just like how you make it. You know how much money is coming in, you know how much money is coming out, and you try to estimate where you're going to spend it in different places based on what you want to do. So my budget might be, I'm only going to spend $100 a year at anthropology. But then the problem is that the Appropriations Committee steps in and says, no, we actually are going to put physically money aside for different things. And it doesn't really matter what your budget says. If I'm going to actually want to spend $100 a month at anthropology, which is what I usually want to do, then my appropriations and my budget aren't going to match. And so appropriations hold a lot more power in Congress, and it's all decided by Congress. So the budget is set by the president, but then the appropriations committees within Congress are the ones that are sending out these 302A and 302B allocations, and they must be passed in early spring, supposedly. But if you guys had noticed, there have been lots of continuing resolutions where people say the government is going to be shut down is because the appropriations committees haven't figured out how to set aside this money, and so they pass something that continues the same way they had for the previous fiscal year. And so although it's supposed to happen in the spring every year, it keeps getting pushed back and back a little bit further. And then an outlay is basically just a fancy word for spending. But if you're ever looking things up on a government website, you need to use the word outlay and not spending to find certain things. So I thought I would mention it here. And like I said, the budgets set by the president and appropriations set by Congress often differ significantly. And I think for engaging in science policy, it's really important to know what people are talking about, because sometimes you hear sensational things in the news, like Trump is going to cut all science funding. And if you look at the yellow, you'd be right. He is trying to cut science funding. And he suggested, based on his fiscal policy, that we reallocate money away from these scientific agencies. But Congress is a bit more steady than the Office of the President usually, and tries to keep funding relatively constant to these agencies, and actually increased funding for almost all of them despite Trump's budget request. And so it's important to know, where you are in the budget process, if appropriations are happening or if the budget is coming out. And following those newsletters is really helpful because they tell you when those bills are coming now that they're not on such a set schedule. So where does science fit into this funding? So the overall spending of 2018, so we're talking about outlays now from 2018, can be broadly broken into 70% mandatory and 30% discretionary. So it's just like our budgets, rent mandatory expense, healthcare mandatory expense. The government has slightly different things that it pays for, but those are mostly determined by a calculator. Interest on the national debt, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, those are things that can't be really controlled. Congress basically sets the next 30% and spends months trying to figure out where that money goes. And it can be broadly broken into defense and non-defense. And it's this non-defense discretionary piece of the pie that really funds almost all of scientific basic research in the United States from a federal side. So I'm not talking about private money here. And you can see that places like NIH are getting it from their health little bracket. And then this really small sliver right here is space and tech. The Department of Energy is under energy. And so you can see that the overall budget is quite small for science. In 2018, basic research in space technology, although it was $31 billion, was only 5% of non-defense discretionary funding and 0.76% of total federal spending. And so that's really important to keep in mind when you're talking to representatives and senators. Science, while it is your life and everything, it is less than 1% of the federal budget. And so it's important to kind of have that perspective that there's other things in the budget of the federal government that are costing a lot more that they might be more focused on. And so it's good to go in with really concrete asks for what you want with the budget. And so here are 3 ideas that you can have for when you're advocating. One of them is increase non-defense discretionary funding. So just take that whole slice of pie that's discretionary non-defense and increase how much we're spending there. The second thing that is a really good thing to advocate for, especially when there's increased defense spending, is to say, it's okay if you want to spend more on defense, but just match how much you spend on defense with non-defense discretionary fundings. Don't let the defense discretionary take up too much of that pie. And then what's really impactful, I think, is when you or yourself are funded by a specific agency and you go in, explain how that research is helping advance the world and how you benefit from that money, and then advocate for increased appropriations to those agencies like NSF or NASA. And they really need about a 3 or 4% increase to combat inflation. And so here are the past 10 or so fiscal years of funding for NASA and NSF. And you can see that despite NASA and NSF both growing over this time, taking on new missions, they haven't really seen 4% or more increases in their budget. And that doesn't really get them anywhere past inflation. And so it's really good to, key in on this when you're talking to people and say that you really need to have certain percentage increases each year for these critical agencies that supply so much innovation to the United States. Okay, so that was a lot. And I promise that that is like the most intense part of the talk, but I hope you guys feel pretty good about where you are with how science is funded and also how it gets through Congress. And the same idea that you can advocate at any step in this process rather than at the beginnings and ends, now that you know a little bit more about it. When it's appropriation season, you can ask your senators for increased appropriations for different agencies. And so I think it's really useful to know what's going on in Congress. Okay, and I don't see any red lights for chat questions, so I'm going to move on. Step 3 is about effective research communication. And basically, the homework that we assign you in the paper is creating a 1-page document. And these are documents that are really helpful because you can bring them to meetings and you leave them behind. And so these leave behind documents should have your contact information, a plain language summary of your research, some sort of impact to a broader societal issue, and then also concrete asks for your policymaker. And so I've put mine as an example on the left, and I tried to do one that was about really fundamental research so that you guys could see how you can try to relate it. And so my research is on the isotopes of amino acids, which is kind of a weird thing to study in the first place. But the idea is that if we can understand the signatures of life here on Earth, we might be able to better understand the signatures of life on Mars, which everyone is really interested in. And there's lots of exciting NASA missions with sample return. And so I tried to write a plain language summary. And then I also specifically asked for an increase in the appropriations for NASA's science funding, and then a few specific bills that I found that were really interesting, including the Space Weather and Forecasting Act. And so this is a nice outline of what you can do for yours. There's lots of other formats though. I really like it when people put their picture in. I almost did that. So this person does ice hazards. This is from the FDAA. It's more of an infographic style. But I find this exercise to be really useful for people, not just for leaving it behind, but for yourself and figuring out what these things are. You know, how does your science really relate to a broader societal issue? How can you summarize it in a short period of time? And so I encourage everyone to make them. You'll see these examples. And if you make one, feel free to email it to me and I'm happy to give it a look. And these people, they keep them, and I've had people reach out to me after and say, hey, I remember that you said that you're an expert in monolake and amino acids. I'd love to ask you a question about this. So it's definitely useful to have these sorts of resources available. Okay, so the next steps are all about meetings. So if you remember, step 4, find your elected officials. Step 5, schedule a meeting with policymakers. And step 6, meet with your representative. So in terms of finding your elected officials, I'll send out some resources, but it's quite easy. It's mostly just a Google search. But when I really mean find, I also mean research. And so you want to look up their sort of background, their legislative history, their website, and I'll show you an example of that. Scheduling a meeting is the hardest part. So it took me a really long time to schedule meetings. And the things that really help are if you go with a professional organization or a place like Caltech, right? If you represent a larger group than just yourself. And so when I went, I represented AGU, which is a network of 90,000 people. And it's a lot easier to get in the door when they think you're representative of a larger constituency than just yourself. You can also go to represent Caltech. That's a really good constituency to represent. If you can get a group of 4 or 5 of you together to make a meeting all together, then it is much more impactful than just one person. And then finally, most professional organizations host visit days. So AGU every year hosts visits for people to go meet with their policymakers and handles making the meetings for you in those groups. And so those are great ways to get started. And then the next step is meeting with your representative. And so I'm curious from you guys, what do you think would make a successful meeting with a representative? I'll keep my chat up. Finding common ground, totally. Yeah, it's always good to start with just chatting with them instead of going in and bulldozing them about NASA funding. Although you should do that second. Getting them excited about the thing you care about, totally. Being concise and respectful of their time, yeah. Leaving them with easy to digest information. You guys would do well in meetings. Yeah, being respectful of their time. It usually takes about 6 months to schedule some of these meetings. And, they are swamped. They're probably meeting with, 20 people that day. Leaving them with next steps outlined, totally. Yeah, and leaving them with information to contact you and then following up is really important.
Alex, I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you, for any of these steps, do you do anything different if you perceive your representative to be an ally or an advocate of what you're saying, or someone that's, you think is contrary to what you're trying to push for?
Yeah, and I think, in California, it's mostly allies, right? So we're in pretty good Pretty good place here, but my friends who are in more Republican states and advocating for increased non-defense discretionary funding can be hard, but as long as you're respectful, it's okay. It's definitely more shaped in the ask. I don't really change anything, and I don't think they change anything except for the final ask. What I ask for from Dianne Feinstein is going to be very different than what I asked from Mitch McConnell, right? I know one of them is more of a supporter of me already, and so I can ask for something a lot greater. That's a great question. But I would definitely still introduce your research and societal concerns in the same way you would for a Democrat or Republican. One thing that I do kind of shift is, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, but when I met with Representative Judy Chu, I knew that she was really interested in veterans affairs. And so I tried to find a connection between my research with the USGS, which hires a lot of veterans, and the work I was doing. And I tried to weave that connection in. And so that's not something that was specific to her as a Democrat or Republican or an ally or non-ally, but sort of changing my message to be finer tuned for her. Okay, so I wanted to show you guys a quick case study where I did some workshops with about 12 graduate students in my department and postdocs, and they did basically a longer version of what you guys just went through. They learned steps 1 and 2, and then they all made one-page documents. And then we visited the local offices of Dianne Feinstein and Representative Judy Chu. So here's our first group. It was all women, which was fun. And we went to Judy Chu's Pasadena office, which is, 3 blocks from campus. So that was quite convenient. And the first thing that we did was we researched what Judy Chu is interested in. What committees and caucuses does she serve on? What bills has she sponsored or co-sponsored? What issues are displayed on her website? And what could be a... And so what we found was that she's on the Ways and Means Committee, which is a really important tax committee. She's also on the Small Business Committee and the Asian Pacific American Caucus. She recently co-sponsored or sponsored a bill on the San Gabriel Mountains Foothill and River Protection Act. And so when we went into her office, one of the first things we said was, thank you for doing this. This is a piece of your history that we really liked. And we just want to say as constituents that it was really great to see this science-related bill about the San Gabriels, which is our home here in Pasadena. She's also, on her website, she really lists things like education, foreign policy, small businesses, veterans' rights. It's not until the very, very bottom that you see space, and she has a picture in JPL. And there's no mention of Caltech on her website, even though she's 3 blocks away. And that doesn't mean that she's not a supporter of Caltech. It just means that it's not representative of her key issues. And that's okay, but it's useful to know. And so we decided that we wanted her to take a bit more of an active involvement with some of these science bills, because she says she supports them, but she's not making it as much of an issue as she could. And so we wanted her to co-sponsor this American Innovation Act, which increased funding for certain agencies, and the 21st Century STEM for Girls and Underrepresented Minority Act, since she cares so much about education. So what did the meeting look like? It was in a room. It's kind of a boring room. And we met with Enrique Robles. He was one of Judy Chu's staffers. It's really unlikely you're ever going to meet with the actual representative. And honestly, if you're meeting with a staffer, it's usually better. They're the ones that are doing the work on the ground. And so they're the ones that are going to know more about how you can get that action done. Enrique was really great. I hope you guys can all see everyone had their one-pagers. I chose that picture for fun. And so we all took some time to introduce ourselves and talk about our research, and we had a conversation. We respected his time, we kept it short, and Enrique was really interested in hearing what all of our individual asks were. Each person, he said, was there anything you came here specifically to talk to me about? And then as a group, we had our group asks of those 2 bills. Okay, the next half of us went to Dianne Feinstein's LA office. It was a bit more of a drive. And we met with Becca Channel, who's one of Feinstein's staffers as well. We also researched Dianne Feinstein. Now she's on very different committees. As you probably, if you're watching the Supreme Court hearings, you realize she's on the Judiciary Committee. She's also on a science committee, on the Energy Committee. And so she's really active in DOE research. We wanted to thank her for her work on this National Earthquake Protection bill that was sponsored and that she got passed in the Senate. And some of the issues on her webpage are a lot more science focused: agriculture, climate change, economy, and education. And so we wanted her to co-sponsor a few bills, but another ask we had for her was to come visit Caltech, which we actually have in the works, but then coronavirus kind of impacted that a bit, so I'm sorry. It's not my fault. So here are some photos from our visit. It was again in a nice room. We just spoke with Becca. We all had one-pagers. We were armed with coffee. We just had a nice conversation. And what was really interesting was that she didn't want to hear what all of our individual asks were. We all introduced our research and she said, pick one bill, one or two, and I can get those done. But if you tell me 10 things, I won't. Whereas Enrique was like writing down every single bill we mentioned to look into. And so each meeting is going to be a bit different. They were both about 45 minutes long, you know, really nice conversations. And we followed up afterwards. And those bills that we asked to be co-sponsored were co-sponsored. And so this was an email that I received 2 months later, so it takes a little while. And they said that basically it was a direct result from the advocacy of our group. And so if we hadn't gone in there, Judy Chu wouldn't have realized that these bills were maybe out there for her to co-sponsor. And so that was really great, obviously. And I hadn't heard from Becca Channel in a little while. And so I told her that another California representative had actually recently co-sponsored these bills. And so a month later, she also co-sponsored those bills, as well as the two that we advocated for, the American Innovation Act being one of them. And then the Sexual Harassment in the Sciences Act, which had actually passed the House with Judy Chu's co-sponsoring already. And so I hope that that shows you that some of this advocacy really can work when you get involved. And just to show you what the students thought of when they did this workshop and talked with people, is that it really changed their perspective of how much they could make a difference. And so I'm leaving some quotes up from the evaluations because I think it's important to try to remove those barriers mentally too. I know it's really hard to think that your actions would actually make an impact, but with just 6 people in 45 minutes, we had a signature. And that's a big step for science policy. And I'm happy to take some more questions. I have a few more slides, but if anyone has a question at this point, I'm happy to hear it. Okay, great. Okay, so if you don't remember the 10 steps, the first one is to learn how science policy is enacted, then understand how the money gets in, then learn how to say your research in a nice way. And then 4, 5, and 6 are all about meetings. You guys had some great ideas for how you can be respectful in a meeting and what makes a successful meeting. And hopefully now you know what a meeting could look like. And I'm happy to answer more questions too. 7, 8, 9, and 10, I would hope that if you're more interested in these more advanced steps, you would read our paper. But I'm also happy to answer questions that you guys have about them. I definitely encourage you to engage in science policy at conferences. Most large conferences have talks and sessions that relate to science policy and even have visit days. And so I'm just going to remind you of the goals that I started with the start of this talk. And I hope that you guys are convinced that you have a meaningful impact on science policy. And hopefully now that you've seen these 10 steps, you might have a better idea of how to make that happen. So without any other slides ready for you, and hopefully it seems like a good time, I'm happy to take any questions. And thank you guys. It's weird doing this over Zoom, but I hope it's fun.
Thank you so much, Alex. I think Elise has a question.
Oh, sure. Can you guys see when I pull up the chat? Probably you can, right? Oh, you can't. Oh, that makes me feel better. Was imposter something you dealt with in these meetings? And if so, how did you deal with that? Yeah, the first time I went on these meetings, I was so terrified, and it was with AGU. And I basically relied on the group leader a lot. And, you know, I asked her, did that go okay? Did I sound crazy? And we came a bit more prepared. And I think I kind of came across as a little stiff because they're like, so where are you from? And I'm like, the sexual harassment in the science bill is SR 2400. And they're like, okay. And I think that the next time I went, I was more relaxed and I could just kind of, you know, take it a bit easier. I had already emailed them a few times. And I was now the leader for this other group that was feeling more imposter syndrome, and they did great. Just like I'm sure I did the first time, even if I was a little nervous. Having a one-page document and having done your research makes a big difference. You don't want to go in asking them to co-sponsor a bill that they wrote, you know, so I think it's helpful to just come in prepared and knowing what you're going to ask for, and then just trying to have a conversation as much as you can. I'm also happy to set up meetings for anyone that's interested in going and helping you guys navigate them more. Different going as a group of grad students versus with a faculty. I've never gone with a faculty. The group that I went in with AGU, I was the only graduate student and there were postdocs, and I didn't think that affected the dynamic. I would imagine if I went with my PI, it would be a bit different. I would say go with people that you're comfortable with, and it'll be okay. Similar programs to AGU in other fields. Yeah, Cora, that's a good question. I haven't come across too many. The AGU one is quite broad, so if you have any relation to Earth and space science, it's very friendly to that. There must be some other ones. I think it's quite a new program. It's only in its 3rd or 4th year, but I think others are starting to pop up. Nothing that I've heard of. There are a lot of science policy fellowships for after graduate school though, and those are all in the SI of my paper as well. But there's tons of ways to get 1-year postdoc funding to basically become a scientific advisor. And those are really great fellowships, but they're more of actually accepting a job for a year rather than doing a fellowship on the side like the AGU one was. This is so different than a normal Q&A where you're just in an auditorium.
I'm not a fast typer, so I'll just ask verbally again. Do you, when you're not going as a part of an organization specifically, do you recommend reaching out to faculty or to like government relations, for example, at Caltech? Do you have any concerns about, you know, am I getting into the middle of something that maybe somebody else is already working on, or I'm taking things in a different direction?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I didn't mention it, but setting up a meeting, I forgot to, and I should have, is government relations offices at schools are amazing because they already have connections to all of these people. And I had actually emailed Judy Chu and Diane Feinstein's office like 10 times throughout the 6 months and called a few times to follow up. And then I asked Ken Hargreaves, who's our government relations person, hey, like I was hoping to get a meeting with Diane Feinstein, and they emailed me back once and I didn't get anything. And he literally just called Becca on the phone. And then I had a meeting a week later. And then after I had the meeting with Diane Feinstein, I emailed the other person back with a date that we were meeting them, and then they responded with a date. So that pressure to get going was super helpful. I worried about that, you know, representing the interests of Caltech while being a Caltech graduate student. That's unfortunately just something that is going to happen. You have to walk the line of, you know, you need to advocate for yourself as a part of this group. That doesn't mean that whatever you're saying represents Caltech by itself. They hire specific people to do lobbying for us. And so they're going to know, the staffers are going to know if there's a message that's coming from Caltech versus its students. And actually in both of my meetings, Greg, I know you know the lobbyist organization well, but in both of my meetings, they had even said, you know, we care more about what students come in and tell us, because we know that Caltech is paying someone else to say these things, and you're coming here because you're passionate about it and you're interested. And so it tends to make a larger impact than if you are going in with, you know, the Caltech letterhead and saying what their lobbyist is also putting down their door. So I think that answered your question. But
yeah, that was great. Thanks.
Elise is asking me, what am I planning to do with science policy in the future? I'm hoping to get one of those fellowships if I can in a few years, and hopefully become immersed more science policy full time. That's my goal after grad school for sure. Yeah. Is there an incentive for politicians to introduce new bills? How can you judge if a bill is good to support? Yeah, that's a good question, Liz. I do think that there's incentives for politicians to introduce new bills. That's a really big ask when you go in and ask for a new bill. I've never done that ask because I haven't had anything that I felt so passionately about that I think needs to be a new bill rather than just trying to get support for existing legislature. Also think that it'd be hard to judge if a bill is good enough to support. So one thing that can be really helpful is professional organizations like AGU will email you in those listservs when bills that they have come across are important to get the word out. And so we had actually gotten word of the Sexual Harassment in the Sciences Act from an AGU newsletter, and they actually had a letter of support online for it. And so a lot of professional organizations will have archives of letters of support, and so that's a nice way to know that the bill is actually good. And then in this case, the bill had already gone through the House as well, with a lot of support from people already, and so it had bipartisan support and had a lot of professional organizations backing it. So that was a nice making sure it was okay. I guess the other thing I would say is that it's not your job to know if a bill is good, and you're not there to tell them how to legislate or how to enact a law. You're there to tell them what's important to you. And so it's okay if you don't know the specifics of a bill, and just know that it's something that you believe in as an idea. Okay, Catherine, what was important to you in deciding whether to advocate for policy alongside research or to make policy your career choice? Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm sure some people here might be interested in a career in science policy. It was pretty difficult. I didn't have a lot of support from my PI when I started doing science policy work. He didn't like that I went to DC for a few days to do the training for the AGU fellowship, because it was during one of his classes that I was TAing. And he didn't love that it came with a lot of work on the weekends when I could have been doing research. My committee also didn't think it was important for me to get science policy work done in my graduate school career. And I just did it anyway. It became important to me because I realized that some of the skills that make you good at science policy, which are communicating, being passionate, writing, I love science podcasts and politics podcasts. It just seemed like a good fit for my skill set, whereas academia was increasingly becoming less of a good fit that I was trying to force myself to fit into. And going on the DC trip with the Caltech Y was really helpful because I started seeing myself in the places that we visited. I don't make it a focus at work as much as I can, though. So I do most of my science policy on the weekends and advocacy during the week only occasionally when it must be done. And so I think that that's the way that I've been able to strike a balance that makes my committee still happy. And hopefully more other people's PIs might be more supportive from the get-go. Mine is more supportive now. I also got a free trip to AGU out of it, so I think he liked not paying for that conference. Cora, do you know if it's a negative to have worked in explicitly partisan groups, to have campaigned for candidates in the past if you want to go into science policy? No, I wouldn't say that's a negative. I would say that's a positive. A lot of these science policy fellowships just want to know that you're interested in science policy and that I think if you show that you've been involved in the past, it's a plus. It's not necessary to have any experience with science policy before you go in, but I think anything that can strengthen your decision to go into science policy, if it happens to be from doing partisan work, then I think that's totally fair. And I think the idea that science isn't political is kind of not a thing anymore, that people are starting to realize more and more, and it's totally normal to have political interests as a person. I hope that answers your question, Cora. Elise says, yeah, my committee is supportive, but I feel like one problem is they just don't know anything about these options, what to do to prepare. Yeah, that was so funny for me in my thesis committee meeting. At the end, they said, well, what do you want to do? And I said science policy, and I'd like to get these fellowships. And one of my committee members said, the best thing for you to do is just focus on your research and not do any science policy in your grad school. They don't care about that. And that was just kind of the opposite advice that any science policy person had given me. And I had talked to about a dozen of them. And this person had never had any of his students go into science policy. So I think that that's one of the main reasons I wrote this paper, is because there's no formal training in what to do and how to get involved. And we needed a 10-step guide to start us off. So I totally feel that. And I just ignored him, and it was fine. And then he forgot that he gave me that advice. What can undergrads do if they're interested in science policy? I think you can do a lot of these things. If you're not involved in research, that's okay. You can create a one-pager on an issue that you care about. And you can go in as part of a Caltech constituency. You can also go to your, if you're not from Pasadena, so you can visit Pasadena senators and representatives and kind of advocate on behalf of Caltech as being a constituent that lives here. But you can also go back to your home state senators and talk to them about an issue that's of more local concern. You know, one thing that people don't think about is that they feel like because they're an undergrad, or even if you just have a master's, or if you're still in PhD, that you're not an expert in science, but you already have more expertise in science than the staffer that you're meeting with. And so when you go into those meetings, you are the expert in the room. And if you come prepared, then you're even more so. So I think you just have to find something you're interested in. I would definitely, though, recommend, if you have an area of interest, like if you're in the geosciences department, going on a congressional visit day with a professional organization is the easiest way to get started. And tons of professional organizations do them, not just geology. And does Caltech do them anymore, Greg? I think they do, right? He's saying no.
I'm saying I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, sorry, Maisha. I hope that helps. There's definitely some bias having written this as a graduate student.
This may be just the flip side, but any don't do this, or any things you would steer clear of?
Ooh, in meetings?
Sure.
Yeah, I think everyone kind of hinted at it before, but yeah, I think just recognizing that they're a person and that they are hearing elevator pitch after elevator pitch. Don't give them what they're, what they don't want to hear, right? Like, take a minute and get to know them and ask where they grew up and make a personal connection before asking them for something. And before you ask them for something, thank them, right? I think that is a really nice thing to do, and say, hey, I think it's amazing how much Judy Chu has done for this community. And we really liked what she's done in the San Gabriels, especially. And as scientists, I find that really important. And then wait. So I guess the best don't is don't talk the whole time. Because that's something that I've seen, is that you don't let the staffer talk and you go in and talk to them and they never come back and talk to you. If your goal is a conversation, then you have to let the other person speak. You guys have a lot of questions. It's fun. Okay. I was planning to do another workshop, Liz, with Caltech students and scheduled meetings, but then coronavirus happened. I was open to doing them virtually, but it's just a lot of work for me to do for some virtual meetings as I finish my PhD, so I put that on the back burner. But I do have connections with those two offices if anyone is interested in going there, and we can start setting up a cohort through the Caltech Y. But yeah, it was nice to see those results. Even though they're a few months later, it was still really nice.
Any more questions? Yeah, if not, then thank you so much, Alex. It was a very informative talk and I learned so much from it. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming to this talk. We'll see you at the next Caltech Y talk. Thank you.